Hey friends, thanks so much for joining me for session one, the power of a table, the power of hospitality, gathering around the Eshel table. We've had folks that ask us, they see the book and they say, Eshel table, what is Eshel? What does that mean? If you look there in your session guide, in your study guide, I want to say this as well. When you're going through these, I would encourage you to go ahead and read through the beginning material of each session. That'll really bring some light and color to what we're talking about in that session. And then my goal is, the best I can, I want to hit the big ideas in that session so you can spend most of your small group time together unpacking these concepts, really with those discussion questions, praying together, getting ideas, talking about the challenges and perspectives that you might have as you're working through what it means to be hospitable from a biblical perspective. As you look in your study guide on page 25, I want to read an excerpt from the book, The Eshel Table, so you can get an idea where this book the title comes from. We see here, it says Abraham's Eshel tree. Abraham started the tradition of Eshel with the tamarisk tree he planted. He set the stage for hospitality back in the Old Testament. His heart to prepare a place for weary travelers comes from someone who was a weary traveler themselves. Abraham left the booming metropolis of Ur at God's invitation. He left a career, a home, friends, and security. But it was in the wilderness that he truly met the hospitality of God. He knew what it was to be a man without a country when God was about to establish a great nation from him called the Jews. Here's an excerpt from the Eshel table that explains Abraham's heart for hospitality. The tamarisk tree in ancient Hebrew is translated as Eshel. That's where we get the word Eshel from. A tamarisk tree, or salt cedar as it's called today, is a tree that is common in the Middle East. In a dry and hot land, it is a tree that brings relief. This amazing plant is the equivalent of a modern-day air conditioning unit, kind of like a swamp cooler for those of you who've ever seen those. We had one when we were in college. I had one in California that I had to work on multiple times because it broke down. During the day, the tamarisk tree secretes salt. The salt dries. Then during the night, salt absorbs water from the air, and in the morning, the water evaporates, giving off a cooling effect. That's why the tree is so popular in the Middle East. We learn in Genesis that Abraham planted one of these tamarisk trees. Some people say he may have even planted a whole grove of them to provide extra shelter and extra relief. From history, we learn that he would have done that to take care of weary travelers passing by. They could stop in the cool of that tree and rest in the shade and coolness to help revive them for the rest of their journey. Abraham was meeting the needs of friends, family, and even strangers. He didn't know how many people would be blessed by this gift. He planted it and left it to be a blessing to others. He used what he had to provide for others without asking for anything in return. This is the idea of hospitality. Eshel started not as an episode on HGTV. Eshel started with a love for strangers who would become friends with a man who was called the friend of God. The word Eshel is actually, it's an acronym for the Jews to remember to be hospitable. The word Eshel in Hebrew is actually A-I-S-H-E-L. And each part of that word, so the A-I is the first part that goes with the word aleph, which means for food. The word S-H-E is for she or shem, which means water or a drink. And the L represents the word lamed, which means comfort, lodging, or accompaniment. In some translations, the idea is that idea of security. And so basically, Eshel is broken down to three concepts. Food for the A, water for the S-H, she, and comfort for the L, lamed. So food, drink, and comfort. Food, drink, and a place of lodging. When you begin to look at and look for these three archetypes throughout the scripture, all of a sudden we began, as we were studying the scriptures, for Amanda and I, we wrote this book together, we saw it just came up over and over and over again. We see it when Jesus showed hospitality and gathered with people around the table. We see it when he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, that Eshel pops up. We see it where Paul is sharing with the Romans. In Romans, he says that don't repay evil for evil, but repay evil with good. And we see that he uses the same idea. If your neighbor is hungry our enemies hungry, give them something to eat. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. And in so doing, you'll heap coals of fire on their head. So even in that, Jesus says that I was a stranger. And he said, you welcomed me in. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. Again, this idea of Eshel is there. So all throughout Scripture, you see this over and over again. As you look in your notes, we find this. You can go ahead and read on food, drink, and comfort. What is Eshel? But then you see on page 27, we're going to look at this idea of how to demystify hospitality. With the power of the table, how do we demystifying hospitality? It can be so strange and it can be something fearful. But the big idea that we're going to look at in this lesson is hospitality is the ability to turn strangers into friends and friends into family. Why? Because as we go along, we're going to really unpack this. Well, what is hospitality at the core? The literal definition of hospitality is this: it's the friendly and generous reception and entertainment of guests, visitors, or strangers. So the idea is this, is that we're taking people, even specifically people that we live next to, that we live near. We'll go ahead and extend that definition to people. Maybe you see a clerk at the register on a common basis. Amanda and I, we see our neighbors on a consistent basis. We know them by name and we talk to them and see them. We invite them over when it's opportunity presents itself. We have coffee and donuts out in our front yard. At Halloween, we go ahead and we hand out candy, and we have coffee and donuts and apple cider available for our neighbors. We've had neighbors over for dinner. We've had neighbors over for holidays to celebrate together in different moments and opportunities. And so it's the idea of people that we don't know, that they move from being strangers, they become friends, and then they become family. And ultimately, our goal is that become a part of the family of God, to introduce them and point them to the one who showed the greatest hospitality in giving his life for us, Jesus Christ. And so then we look at, well, how do you invite strangers, get them to go from being strangers to become friends? Through one word: trust. How do we develop trust? We look at this simple process, the 3 simple steps to cultivate a space and place of trust. The Eshel table is creating a place for people that's safe for them to be in. How do we do that? Number 1, people have to get to know you. People have to get to know you. They have to know that you care. You can start this by simply, what's your name? Asking them their name is a great place to start. It sounds funny. It sounds crazy. We lived in a small townhouse. Again, after the crazy adventures in our 2-bedroom apartment, we moved then to a little bit larger space as we were starting our family. And our neighbor that we moved in, when we first moved in there, I said, hey, what's your name? My name's Matt. And he said, oh, my name is Chuck. I said, great, Chuck. We lived there for 2 years. Every time I'd come and go, I'd see him outside. They loved to grill out even during the wintertime. And so he had a little Weber grill there on their front patio, on the front porch there. And so I'd say, hey, Chuck, how's it going? Good, Matt, great to see you. Literally the day we're moving out, we got some of their mail. We got some of Chuck's mail. And I look on the mail, and it says Jake on the mail. And so I looked and I thought, well, this is weird. Maybe it was the previous resident at their address. So I walk over and I said, hey, Chuck, we got some of your mail here. And I handed it to him. I said, hey, is your name, like your given name, Jake, but you just go by Chuck as just a nickname? And he said, no. I said, well, what's your name? He said, my name's Jake. I said, well, I've been calling you Chuck for 2 years. Why didn't you ever correct me? And he said, just because it made me and my wife something to laugh about. I said, so you've been laughing at me for 2 years as I called you Chuck and your name's Jake. He said, yeah, at least I know your name. I thought, man, I'm so embarrassed. But the idea is, hey, that was a big mess up, a big flub for me. So anything you do is going to be way better. And the first step, just get to know their name. People have to get to know you. Then number 2, they have to get to like you. You find things that you have in common. One of the best things you have in common, you live on the same street. You have to face the same issues with your township, your borough, the homeowners association. You come and go. You park in similar places and spaces. Weather you have to deal with, depending on where you live in the world, you have to deal with similar weather. When you run into problems, you may have to borrow a tool from a neighbor or some food from a neighbor. We had neighbors just recently give us like 25 pounds of zucchini, more zucchini than we know what to do with. And so we were able to get that from them and made zucchini fries out of them. And so there's just these opportunities that you have that you can interact with neighbors. We've taken neighbors food. A neighbor recently had a baby, and so we took over a meal to them to congratulate them, but also kind of ease the burden a little bit as we took them some food. We've had neighbors in the past who one lost their spouse, and so we grieve with them, going through the bereavement process, and sent them some flowers and gave them some meals to encourage them. So something in common, so they can get to like you. And then ultimately, people have to learn to trust you. Somebody who comes through your front door and sits at your table, there is a given that there's some trust going on there. That they're trusting you. It's not going to be weird. You're not going to do something to them. You're going to actually let them go home. You're not going to kidnap them or hold them against their will. Crazy as that sounds. But the fact that they're coming into your home, that there's trust that's being developed. And the more they come in and spend time together, the greater that there's trust involved. But then not only that, we find this. Well, then what is hospitality from the Bible? There's hospitality in the Old Testament. We see that hospitality there was a code of conduct. Hospitality was a way of caring for people around us. We see in Leviticus 19:18, it's the first time that we are commanded to love our neighbors, that Moses writes, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." So he gives this command from God, from the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we see Jesus took it up a notch. As you see there on page 28, Jesus' definition of hospitality went from just taking care of your neighbor. He says loving people the way Jesus loved them. In John 13:34 and 35, look at what Jesus says there. He says, "So now I am giving you a new command, that you love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples." And so Jesus was saying, Matthew, do you remember how I treated you when you were a tax collector and everybody didn't like you, and I invited you in and I invited you to follow me? Love other people like that, people that are kind of outcasts on the outskirts, estranged. Peter, you remember how I was patient with you when you continually stuck your foot in your mouth, and I was really gracious when you kind of talked out of turn and said things, crazy things? Do you remember when you denied me? Love people like that. Thomas, do you remember when you doubted me? Well, when people doubt you, love them anyway. Hey, all of you, the night that you deserted me and left me to die, literally, love people just like that. What does hospitality mean for you personally, though? As we get into this, we'll look at what does hospitality look like in the Bible, and then what does it mean for you personally. First of all, number one there in your notes, hospitality is a gifting. It's a gifting from God. Hospitality, well, you say, but I don't have the gift of hospitality. We're going to talk about that everybody has a part of hospitality, a gifting. Maybe you don't have the gifting to cook, but we'll talk about that you do have a gifting to be able to host and be able to relate to people. And it's amazing as we'll unpack what it really means with this gifting. 1 Peter 1:8 and 10, it says, "Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling." So evidently, whoever Peter was writing to, they would say, yeah, I guess you can come over to my house. I guess if you have to. I guess if you're hungry. I guess if you have no place to stay right now, I'll offer it. Peter obviously heard this and said, hey, listen, give people food, give people something to drink, and give them a place to stay, and don't complain about it. And so even if it's not your gifting, it's still a command for us. He says, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. So he says, even if you say, well, like helping people out, that's not my thing, but you have a gift that you can use to express hospitality in some way or another, and we'll talk about what that expression looks like. Then we'll see, number 2, as you see, hospitality is community. In Romans 12:12-14, rejoice in our confident hope. Be patient in trouble. Keep on praying. When God's people are in need, be ready to help them. Always eager to practice what? Hospitality. Go ahead and circle that. Bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. Offer hospitality. Then we find number 3. Hospitality is a habit. Don't forget to show hospitality to strangers, for some who have done this have entertained angels without realizing it. So hospitality, make it a habit. Then we find number 4. Hospitality is obedience. John 13:34-35. We just read these verses a moment ago. He says, I'm giving you a new commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you're my disciples. We see that Jesus again reiterates this for us, that when we extend an invitation to somebody, when we give them something to drink, give them something to eat, when we give them a place to sit, we make it comfortable for them, when we give people a safe place to connect, that's a practical expression of love. Love is in a cup of water. Jesus said, if you give to a little one a cup of water in my name, you've done it to the least of these. You've done it for me. He said, if you've done this and expressed this. So when you offer an invitation to somebody, literally, now catch this, it's literally as though you're inviting Jesus to come into your home. You say, but my neighbor, like, you don't know my neighbors. My neighbors, they're not a follower of Jesus. They're anything but like Jesus. And yet, throughout the scriptures, and we're going to unpack this even more in the sessions to come, that when you invite somebody in, Jesus says, when you've done it for the least of these, or when you've done it for one of these, when you've done it for somebody who's in need, it's as though you're inviting me in. That's a powerful, powerful understanding of what hospitality is. When we look at hospitality, the big idea is this as we wrap up. Hospitality says, I have more than enough to share because I've been given more than enough from God. I have more than enough to share because I've been given more than enough from God. That God has, because He's so richly blessed us, that we can share not just from our kitchen, not just sharing our tables, but we really share from our hearts and we share from our homes. And here's the reality. There's no perfect hospitality. When you extend an invitation to somebody, they may not show up. We've had that happen. When you extend an invitation to somebody, they may do something or say something. Something in your house may even get broken. Now, I'm not saying that's what you should hope to have happen, but we've had that happen when we've invited families with kids that come to our house. We've had that taking place. We've had all kinds of things. We've had neighbors just come and pour their hearts out and stay and talk. And we're going to unpack all these things. How do you work through when it's just not a good fit? How do you work through that? How do you get somebody from your table to send them home because it's just like not working out? How do you work through that time? How do you pray with somebody? How do you talk to somebody when you don't have the answers? What do you do when you disagree? How do you handle it when things are going really, really well and there's interruptions going on around you? How do you handle those moments? So I'll talk about all those in the sessions to come. But as we consider this, I'd encourage you with this to realize that hospitality is a powerful expression of God's love from our hearts to those who are around us. We'll look forward to seeing you in the next session as we talk about this incredible idea, this concept of Jesus' heart for hospitality. Just as we talked about in this session a little bit, Jesus has an incredibly, incredibly great heart for hospitality. Thanks so much for watching.